Much. Miller, is that correct, the singing group? Hyde and Han County. Wright and Miller. Oh, right. Okay, all right. Well, I want to congratulate you. I think that was a very nice singing group, and they did extremely well tonight. I'm an amateur singer myself, so I can really appreciate that. I want to say a couple words about the consumers. Well, Manuel Hilly, the first thing, Manuel Hilly came up here and he was hobbling. Did you see him when he came up to the front table up here and hobbled bent over a little bit? And I asked him what was wrong, and he said he'd had Bensonitis ever since 1956. And I said, well, Benson's not in office anymore. Well, he says, you know what they call it in 1975, a pain in the butts. Now, Manuel Hilly said that, I didn't. I want to tell you how successful the Farmers Union participation in the reverse beef-in was this summer. I think it was of tremendous import and success because we brought 7 or 8 national consumer advocates to South Dakota, part of them under the sponsorship of the Farmers Union. And we took them around the state fair, and they worked with farmers, lived with farmers, talked to them, listened to them, and they go back to their constituency, and they represent millions of consumers around the country. And they're going back and telling them what they found out here in South Dakota. They found out about the high price of equipment. They found out that farmers don't set the price for their product. They take what they're offered or they have to go without. And they find out how hard it is to be a farmer. And I think that can only do one thing, and that is be beneficial to people in agricultural states and in South Dakota. So I want to express my thanks to the Farmers Union and Ben Radcliffe for the tremendous help that all of you gave us in that effort to try to win consumer understanding. I want to express my condolences and regrets to the Frank Butler family. Frank, all of you know, and he's listed in the program, excuse me, died in a plane crash earlier this year. And just not long before he did that, Frank had stayed a week with me out at my house in Washington. And we were the closest of friends, and I know all of you miss him as I do. And so my condolences to the members of the Farmers Union as well. In the audience tonight, incidentally, are Harvey Woolman, my good friend, the Lieutenant Governor, and Jack Weiland, the Public Utilities Commissioner and Chairman of the Commission. I just want to say a word about Jack Weiland. Now, there have been some wild charges made about Jack Weiland, but I'm going to tell you one thing, that there has never been an advocate for the people of South Dakota like Jack Weiland on the Public Utilities Commission, and they can't take that away from the people. Well, let me tell you that. He is an excellent, a good man. And don't let any amount of political propaganda tell you any differently, because when a man is tough against the utilities and when he stands up for the people, they'll use anything to try to take that away from him. Please don't let them do it, because you're going to be the ones to suffer if that happens. I also want to thank the Farmers Union as well for providing me with 2 of my best staff members out in Washington. Your former editor, Al Burke, and also the receptionist that's been with me almost a year now, Lorna Pranger. Now, I imagine everybody here knows Lorna. Well, I'm going to tell you one thing. Everybody in Washington knows Lorna now, because the people that come in our front office, she greets everybody who comes in. Now, you people who've been out there know that. But the people from the East Coast who come in the office on one kind of business or another, for the first time in their lives have heard somebody sing a Farmers Union song. And Lorna sings them all day long out there in the front office. And they come back and tell me, they say, Jim, we've never seen anybody so honest and direct and straightforward in our lives. And what kind of people do you have out there in South Dakota? And I said, well, Lorna represents them. And she was a Farmers Union girl for all of her young life, too. Well, I very much appreciate this opportunity to address the annual convention tonight. I know that this is one of the largest, if not the largest, regular gatherings of the family farmers throughout our state. It's an honor to be on a convention program that's met the important issues of rural America directly and honestly. I have great respect for your national president, Tony Deschamps, as well as for Ben Radcliffe, your state president, and for all of you rank and file farmers and ranchers who make this organization strong and make it powerful and do good things for agriculture in South Dakota. I'm very happy that your program has included a discussion of the new land program which has been put together in Saskatchewan, Canada. It's an idea that I'm very fond of and one that ought to be considered for our state of South Dakota and for our entire nation. And I only wish that I could have been here to listen to the speech by the president of that Saskatchewan Land Bank. Now, before I get into the regular part of my speech, I want to say a few words about the problems that we're having, all of us are having, with the A.S.C.S. office. As many of you know, the A.S.C.S. would like to phase out the community committeeman system. That's part of the trend in the agency to get away from grassroots involvement and to concentrate decision-making in the state office and in the Washington office. Now, I'm against that. Senator McGovern and I have introduced a sense of the Senate resolution that would direct A.S.C.S. to keep the community committeemen and to rely much more on farmer-elected committeemen to operate the farm program and for other United States Department of Agriculture programs. Now, the Ford administration has done a lot of job owning about the need to take government back to the local level. The A.S.C.S. has had local involvement through the farmer-elected committeemen since the year of 1936. The A.S.C.S. was the first great American effort to democratize a nationwide program. That is, get it down to the people. I don't think we ought to stand idly by while this program is being destroyed. I hope that we can get the resolution that we've introduced passed. And I hope that with your support, we can convince the Department of Agriculture that the community committeemen should be kept on the job and relied upon much more than they are now. Now, I'm here tonight to talk also about the virtues of a free market system. Now, we've all heard talk about a free market from the White House, from Exxon Oil Company, and from Ralston Purina's man in the Department of Agriculture, Secretary of Agribusiness Earl Butz. But if you only casually listen to these people, you might be led to think that there is a completely free market operating. Now, they want us to enjoy the benefits of a free market in oil and in natural gas, in grain and livestock, and about everything else you can think of. But they'd rather talk about this mythical free market than to do one single thing to really make the marketplace absolutely free. One thing you hear almost every day from the Ford administration is that if it weren't for too many government regulators, we'd have a completely free market. All of us get a little fed up with the bureaucracy in Washington, and cutting down on government regulations sounds good. But let's look at that old line a little bit more closely. The president says that the only way we can get enough oil for this country is to remove the price controls and government regulations from oil. He also says that the price of fuel has to be jacked up before Americans will conserve oil and petroleum products. Now, what happens when you take the controls off of oil? I'll tell you what happens, and you'll see that in so many words. What happens is that your billfold is going to get lighter and your bank account smaller. The price of what is called old crude oil, that is oil from oil wells which were producing in 1972, has been under control at $5.25 a barrel. Now, that accounts for over 60% of the oil that we produce domestically in this country. Now, those same regulations have forced the big oil companies to share some of their oil with the independent and the cooperatives, the cooperative oil operators and the independent oil operators. Now, what happens when you take the controls off of oil? The price of 60% of our domestic crude oil will go up from $5.25 a barrel to $13.50 a barrel. And the big companies will not have to share their crude oil with any of the independents or the co-ops anymore. Now, saying it bluntly, that means that the smaller oil companies don't have to worry about being in business, because they're going to go out of business. If a big part of their oil supply is cut off and hogged by the majors, that means they have no more oil with which to sell their customers. Now, I thought we were supposed to enjoy a free market if the government took its leash off of the big oil companies. The trouble with that argument is that some of the facts are missing. Now, let me give you some of those missing facts. The petroleum and natural gas industry is not competitive. These giant companies are vertically integrated just like the conglomerates in the food industry. They do their own producing, their own refining, their own transporting, and their own marketing. They control every single phase of the oil and natural gas industry from when you take it out of the ground till the time they pump it out of the gas station. Every single phase they control. Now, not only do these giant oil corporations gain their market power through this vertical integration, but they also agree not to compete with each other. And they do it by banding together in joint drilling ventures and in the joint ownership of pipelines. Now, consider the following figures, the statistics I'd like to cite to you. 7 of the largest corporations in this country are oil companies. The 7 giant oil companies had sales last year of over $134 billion. $134 billion in sales. Now that figure, $134 billion, is bigger than the gross national product of all the nations in the world except the top 6 countries. In other words, they put the oil companies together and they have a gross national product that is 7th in the world. Now that is a big company, and that is economic concentration. The 16 major oil companies own 72% of our domestic crude oil production. They have 75% of our refining capacity, and they account for 70% of all retail gasoline sales. The top 4 oil companies control an estimated 81% of the nation's available new natural gas supplies. 81% of our natural gas supplies. Well, the president is not telling the whole story when he says that government controls are preventing us from having a free market in oil. All I can tell you now is that if it weren't for the tiny leash the government has on the big oil companies, the price of gas would already be $1 a gallon. It would very well go to that in the foreseeable future anyhow, even under the control system, if the president allows those controls to go upward. Now, I could talk about the monopolistic activities of the oil companies for a long time to come. I want to talk about them just a little bit more in a couple paragraphs in this speech. But I want to talk a little bit more about the free market system, and this time the free market system in food. That's something you're also very much interested in. Now, President Ford and Secretary Butts tell us that they want a free market in the food industry. Secretary Butts has campaigned all over the country, running down government farm programs and talking about exports. Now, when the infamous Russian grain deal of 1972 raised grain prices to record levels, a lot of people, including myself, were initially pleased with that kind of exporting. And I know a lot of people here were. I know that you are for exporting grain products as well as I am. I think it's a good thing. We like the idea of selling grain overseas because that gives us a good market. But now what happened? George Meany, Secretary Butts, Secretary Kissinger, and the President all got together and put a stop to overseas grain sales. They put a big cork in the end of the grain export pipeline. I think that farmers, the people in this room, people all over the country that are farmers, ought to have a great deal to say about who we sell grain to and when it's sold and how much we sell. Unfortunately, the only thing that farmers are able to say under the present circumstance is, I have to take whatever you give me, whatever you offer for the grain. We all know that to be true. Do you know how much this horsing around with our grain exports has cost us right here in South Dakota? Now let's do a little bit of figuring. South Dakota's wheat crop this year totals over 66 million bushels. If the embargo on sales to Russia and Poland has reduced the market price just 25 cents a bushel, and many people think that the real figure may be 2 or 3 times that amount, then it has cost South Dakota wheat producers $16.5 million alone. And that's a conservative estimate. $16.5 million. The real figure could go as high as $30 to $50 million. Now, thanks to George Meany in the Ford administration, Russia has now scrounged all the grain it can buy from every other country in the world except the United States during the embargo. The Farmers Union and other farm organizations have pointed out in their weekly publications that much of Russia's pressure to buy has been reduced by picking up a sizable amount of grain in small lots around the world. Earlier this year, the president vetoed the farm bill. He said it was much too expensive. Secretary Butz went from one end of the country to the other, fighting and campaigning against the farm bill. What are they doing this year, in October of 1975? They're going all over the country and campaigning to give $11 billion away to Israel in armaments, because they couldn't afford to give the farmers any money at all out of the federal treasury. But we can give away $11 billion in foreign aid just at the snap of a finger like that. The sad thing is today that we do not have a good farm bill that could provide decent loan rates so you could hang on to your grain and wait for the best price. No, we don't have a good farm bill, but we do have an embargo. And to top it off, Mr. Ford, Mr. Kissinger have promised a gigantic arms foreign aid giveaway. Now, Mr. Butz said the farm bill was far too expensive, and I say the embargo has been too expensive for the American farmer. And what they're saying reminds me very much of a story that I like to tell every once in a while about Daniel Boone, when one night the moon was shining bright and he saw a possum swinging from branch to branch up in the treetops. And he was an expert shot, and he pulled up his gun and he fired and he missed because the possum kept swinging. And he fired the second time and he missed, and the possum was still swinging up in the treetops and the branches. And he fired the third time and missed, and couldn't understand why he was missing the possum when he was such a good shot, when he finally realized that it was not a possum after all, it was merely a louse crawling through his eyebrows. Now, I think Secretary Butz ought to spray the lice in his own eyebrows before he goes out and criticizes a farm bill or a good farm program like he's doing. Now, I don't have a pile of statistics on the corporate grain trade. There's a reason for that. The grain trade does not make available to Congress its financial shenanigans, and we cannot get the figures from them, at least at this point. But I do know this, that a handful of huge grain companies call the shots. Now, these few companies like Cargill and Continental and Bunge have more to say about the prices farmers receive for their product than all of the farmers in the country. Any one of the big grain companies is bigger than all of the grain co-ops and the National Farmers Union lumped all together. Now, there's a grain inspection scandal surfacing right now, and you've all heard about it. One of the biggest grain traders, Bunge, was indicted and pleaded no contest in court and has been fined for shipping adulterated and misweighted food grains overseas. You may have heard the story that's going around about the grain trade. Now, the story is that on any given month, farmers send 100 million bushels of grain down to the big grain companies so they can ship it overseas. The grain companies weigh in 100 million bushels, but when they weigh it out, it's 105 million bushels. You might say that they've got a 5 million bushel thumb that they put on the scale when they weigh that grain and send it out. The corporate grain trade is another of the problems farmers are up against when they go to the marketplace. But there's a lot more that happens after you sell your grain for whatever price they decide to give you. Our food industry is every bit as monopolistic as the oil industry. But don't take my word for it. Here are some figures that I've gotten from the Federal Trade Commission and from the Agribusiness Accountability Project. Now, using Safeway as an example of vertical integration in the food industry, their $7 billion empire includes more than 2,000 supermarkets. Now listen to these figures. 2,000 supermarkets, 109 manufacturing plants, 16 produce packaging plants, 16 bakeries, 16 ice cream plants, 19 milk plants, 3 meat processing units, 4 soft drink bottlers, 3 coffee roasting plants, but they only have 1 soup factory, I'm happy to report to you. And they've only got 1 peanut butter factory as well, and 1 salad oil factory. Now, this massive production is handled through 60 Safeway distribution warehouses by Safeway's own fleet of 2,100 tractor trailers. And on top of all this, Safeway now owns half interest in Holly Farms fried chicken restaurants. Safeway shows what is meant by a gigantic food empire. But there's also a thing called horizontal integration. That's where a handful of companies capture control of a market. Now, economists say that when 4 companies control over half of a market, then you've got an oligopoly, which is a close relative to a monopoly. It's hard to tell the difference in most cases. In the food industry, 4 companies control 90% of the breakfast cereals, 65% of the bread and prepared flour, 56% of the processed meats, 65% of the cane sugar, 80% of the canned goods, and 1 company controls over 90% of the soup sold in this country, Campbell's Soup. Now, there are many more examples of the power of conglomerates in the food industry. The wonders of corporate growth have brought us what you might call a conglomerate meal. Now, let's look at a conglomerate meal. You could start out eating this conglomerate meal by having mushrooms produced by Clorox, wrapped in bacon by ITT. Then how about a salad with lettuce from Dow Chemical Company and tomatoes from Gulf and Western Corporation? And for a main course, you can have turkey by the Greyhound Bus Company, or ham by Ling Temco Vote, which is an aircraft company. And you can have Tenneco Oil Company carrots, artichokes made by Purex Bleach, and applesauce by American Brands. Lever Brothers makes tea, Philip Morris Cigarette Company makes beer, or you can have orange juice from the Coca-Cola Company. Even your dessert can come from the corporate kitchen. ITT makes chocolate cream pie, R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company makes pudding, Lever Brothers and United Brands make ice cream, and you can top it off with a handful of almonds produced by the folks down at Tenneco Oil Company. Well, it all rings hollow when some of our leaders in Washington talk about the free marketplace. It isn't free for anybody except for them. And it can't be free for the public so long as we allow giant corporations to have a stranglehold on the public. I very much like the idea of a free marketplace, but I don't like to talk about it only. I think we ought to begin doing something about bringing the myth into reality. To make the marketplace work, like we've been taught it's supposed to work, is something that we all have to turn to. Now, as you know, one of my top priorities is antitrust legislation. I was recently appointed to the Antitrust and Monopoly Subcommittee on the Senate Judiciary Committee. This is the committee that's chaired by our leading antitrust advocate, Senator Philip Hart of Michigan. Last week, the Senate reached a landmark point when it voted on an amendment I introduced to break up the oil companies, and Ben referred to that earlier. It was the first time that the Senate had ever voted on a measure to put a stop to the monopoly practices of big oil. I want you to know that a lot of us were delighted and mystified when that amendment came very close to being passed by the Senate, and the first time out, it narrowly lost by a vote of 54 to 45. 54 to 45 to break up the big oil companies. We need a few more votes, and we've got it made. Now, the antitrust amendment would have required divestiture of the 18 or 20 largest oil and gas companies. It would change the structure of the industry to the extent that Exxon might still be the biggest producer, refiner, or transporter, but not all 3. Well, I was very happy with this near victory, but you can bet that John D. Rockefeller was not. He was turning over in his grave, most likely. And I'll bet the president of Exxon had indigestion that day. Now, if we can keep the present momentum going, I think that by as early as next year, we might see new antitrust legislation on the books. I wish that we were as close to breaking up the conglomerates in the food industry. Since 1971, I've been working on the Family Farm Antitrust Act. As you know, this bill would force the conglomerates out of the farming business. Any conglomerate with more than $3 million in assets would have to sell off its farming interest. The Family Farm Antitrust Act would be a big step toward protecting the family farms and ranches, and it would stop the snowballing monopoly growth of the big food conglomerates. It would be a new concept in antitrust law, and I hope that it soon can become a reality. Now, I congratulate the Farmers Union and your president, Ben Radcliffe, for your effort in getting a good family farm law passed in South Dakota. Now, I said at the beginning that I came here to talk about the virtues of the free market, and I mean that. A marketplace that is free from monopoly power can be good for family farmers and for all Americans. But taking off what few protections we have in the form of government supervision of the monopolies is not the answer. Decontrolling oil and deregulating natural gas only means higher prices, and it means higher and higher profits and more market power for the big oil companies. Until Congress and the administration can agree on a tough antitrust policy that brings competition to the marketplace and ends domination by the big and powerful, we have to rely on stopgap regulation activities to protect the public interest. I say to you that the time has come for a free marketplace. Now let's work hard to convince the leadership in Washington that we want antitrust action that will create a free market and take the suffocating power away from the oil conglomerates. Let's take the rhetoric from Ford and Butts and Exxon and let's turn it into meaningful action. Thank you very much.